Okay, so here goes with a SSC course wrap-up, and in the context of this, I'm also going to describe the assignment that I want you guys to do to wrap up the course on your own. So this is my version. This is the prompt. So the idea is to identify 3 things you learned about yourself, or 3 things that grabbed you during the time frame in which Self, Society, and Cosmos took place this semester. I want you to write about these learnings, how they came about, and so forth, and write about how you think they'll be useful to you in your ongoing work on your own worldview. So the assumption there is that this is kind of a class that never ends in a certain sense. So I want you to use at least 4 of the texts, articles, videos, etc. we read to support and add dimensionality to your own thoughts, cognitions, and feelings, emotions about your learnings. And then place this text as a 6th and final post on your course blog. And this is due Thursday, December 11th at noon. Okay, so since I have a student's mind, and never mind, Confucius had the same problem. There's a famous quote from Confucius, and it's something close to, at the age of 15, my heart was set on learning, or something like that. So he sort of identified himself with this process of learning quite early on. So anyway, I'm going to walk through an example of 3 things that I learned about myself during the time Self, Society, and Cosmos took place this semester. And I want to use this as a way of providing a kind of example, and at the same time a way of wrapping up the class from my own point of view. So the idea of the assignment is, again, for you to wrap up the course in your own way, from your own point of view. But I'm going to kind of walk through this as a way to get your thinking started on that. So for me, the task of being a professor is always about making and keeping it real. So I don't want it to be just this kind of abstract, disconnected body of information kind of approach. And so I'm always trying to find ways to connect it. And so the 3-dimensionality thing for me is one way that I try to keep myself on task, if you will. And so in this case, this is sort of like a 3-dimensional model of how I perceive my own work. And so it's got a scholarly dimension, it's got a creative dimension, it's got a personal dimension. And so at any given time, I try to keep all 3 of these things in a kind of balance or harmonic balance or something like that. So these are elements that I use, and I use this kind of framework to try to keep myself in the realm of making and keeping it real. So in terms of the 3 things that I learned about myself, or the things that grabbed me or stood out for me this term, the first one, and I'm putting these in the context of learning networks, right? So I'm already kind of building in some concepts here, but basically, so the learning network number 1, or the first thing that I want to talk about in terms of the things I learned about myself this semester, was that the dimensionality framework actually works, or anyway, it works for me. So I'm kind of still at work on this general proposition that we not only perceive reality in 3 dimensions, but we also conceive of reality in the same way. And so I think for me, at least so far, it has proved to be useful to think 3-dimensionally when trying to solve a problem or learn something or piece something together. And one way to depict that 3-dimensional learning is to use a simple kind of network diagram like I've got over here. And again, I'm using kind of like quasi 3-dimensional representational forms, these kind of cylinders, to kind of subtly reinforce this idea of dimensionality. So for example, in this first instance, and this would be an example of me kind of citing my sources in the course for this particular learning network. So for me, the shrine projects were one of these. I think I mentioned the 3-dimensionality of the shrines, I think is pretty compelling. So I think when I see them out in the gallery space, and when I saw people working on them, there's something really holistic about working with 3-dimensional materials and combining those with conceptual materials. And so the shrine projects were one example of this learning network. One of the reasons this came to stand out for me, and I liked all those kind of conceptual connections we were kind of exploring between the sort of spiritual way of knowing and the physical aspects of that, whether they be ritual or the building of religious structures or whatnot. And then another one, source for this dimensionality thing would be the Gowland and McBurney article we read. That was in the last batch of articles on evolutionary psychology. And so this is where I drew that idea that we perceive in 3 dimensions. And so they call attention to the significance of that. And what I'm kind of doing is putting a spin on that and saying, well, let's look at that also in terms of what about if the mind works in the same way? And that already begins to dovetail into this mind-body connection that we've been kind of working into the entire term. So that's the second piece of my network there, is that particular article. So another one of my sources for this particular learning would be that article. And then a third one that I would reference would just be my own sort of commitment to this sort of 3-dimensional framework of keeping it real by including and interrelating personal, creative, and scholarly elements in my practice as an instructor or professor. And so that's sort of like the first thing that I learned was that this framework seems to be relatively sturdy, even if it's not quite fully formed just yet. So let's see here. My second learning network is that the thing that stood out for me was that emotional intelligence can be learned. And so this is a little bit like the work that Betty Edwards did around the teaching of drawing. Many adults think they cannot draw, and she challenged basically anyone to explore a way of drawing that made that proposition not true. Anyone can draw, and she sort of demonstrated that. So we might think of something like emotional intelligence as being on the same order, like you're either born with that, or you're either good at that or not right out of the gate. And so what I'm learning this term, one of the things I'm learning about myself is that in fact it can be learned. So this is added to my knowledge of myself in a way. So, and then to dovetail back to the dimensionality piece, it's also occurred to me that in part emotional intelligence can be learned by adding dimensions. And so in my case, again, emotional intelligence is a kind of mind-body thing. So it's sort of putting together the brain in your head and the brain in your gut, or the kind of idea that we are the kind of combination of mind-body, and emotional intelligence reflects that combination pretty well, I think. So in my case, readings on the need for emotional intelligence can be helpful, and that's kind of where I was entering this particular semester, actually. It was having, read enough but a lot of times it was people that were just sort of pointing out that there is this gap, in emotional intelligence, without necessarily saying how we close that gap. So that's kind of where I was, and so in my network here, my learning network, I've got readings on the topic which were already part of my network, and then I added dimensions to that. So one of those dimensions was the Jill Bolte-Taylor TED Talk that we saw on the last day of class that talked about, I love this phrase of hers, that we can access the deep circuitry of the right hemisphere. And, we did some techniques. I like that we explored Tai Chi. I like that we used some silent meditation in conjunction with conversation. I think those were, really positive things to do. And those are the kinds of things that are typically associated with accessing this deep circuitry of the right hemisphere. Also, as we already mentioned, the Herbert Watsky Brain in Your Gut TED Talk is also part of my network. So both of these two presentations down here in the diagram were things that I added to my network around this notion of emotional intelligence, and actually made quite a difference to add those. And I guess one that I mentioned earlier was also part of this network that's not in the picture would be the Betty Edwards drawing on the right side of the brain framework. So. And I've also been learning techniques, as I mentioned in the last class or two, for developing emotional intelligence, learning these from a counselor. And so this has been really helpful to me as well. So I put that personal counselor in there. So this is, again, reflects kind of like the personal, scholarly, creative combination that I mentioned at the top of this particular presentation. So I wanted to share some things related to that. One, I wanted to sort of harken back to our diagram, the original one, of the 4 ways of knowing: intellectual, scientific, aesthetic, and spiritual, and how that we had this kind of substrate for those: the emotional, experiential base for the aesthetic and spiritual, and the cognitive, propositional for the intellectual and scientific. Excuse me. And then I wanted to add this other piece, that the kind of right hemisphere and left hemisphere brain material seems to map perfectly onto this diagram. So, this is kind of a clunky version of the left hemisphere here, the kind of red outline. But I think it fits pretty well, and that was a pretty compelling presentation. And so that's one kind of additional, riff on the idea of emotional intelligence, would be combining left and right hemisphere. So anyway, to go back to the personal counseling, sort of what can how can you learn emotional intelligence, which seems like a fairly ephemeral type of, or vaporous kind of idea. So these are the techniques I mentioned in class, and you may find these useful. I could do a quick summary here. So what you do to sort of develop empathy and also encourage it in others is to use this kind of framework that's down here at the bottom. For example, I mean, you could read past these as well, but the basic framework is to say to a person who has done or said something to you, that you would say, when you fill in the blank did or said thus, I felt thus and such because thus and such. So it allows you to focus in, in fairly explicitly calling forth your emotions, not just your ideas about what might be right or wrong, or who might be right or wrong, or that kind of thing. So this is one framework in which you develop emotional intelligence, or you learn it by practicing it in everyday interactions with people. And then the other part of that, which I mentioned, was this: when you're being a listener and trying to really understand where the other person's coming from, you might say something to that person, that again reflects that you're saying something about your own emotional response to what they said, perhaps, or what they did, perhaps. And you try to keep that brief, and then as a listener, you are wanting to mirror or paraphrase what you heard them say. So you kind of feed that back and say, so if basically you're saying, if I heard you right, you're saying thus and such. And you put it in your own words, and then you give that person an opportunity to sort of modify that or say, yeah, that's exactly what I meant. And then to validate that would be the next step in producing a kind of empathic connection with the person, is to validate it and say, it doesn't mean you agree with it, but you would say something to the effect that I can see that you would come to that conclusion, or I can see that you're reasoning there. And then the third step is to actually create the empathy by saying, whatever that was, your understanding of that, I can see how that would make you feel really thus and such, right? So then again, you're connecting it back to the emotional self, and that's partly where the empathic connection comes from. So through these types of techniques, again, similar to Betty Edwards' techniques for drawing on the right side of the brain, you actually can do concrete things that develop this emotional intelligence. So that would be my second learning that I've done this term, and it has those references. So it has to go back to the diagram there, it has the personal counseling material, which I just reviewed, the sort of prior readings on the topic of emotional intelligence, and then the two texts we took up in this particular term that I had not looked at prior to this term, the Jill Bolte-Taylor TED Talk and the Herbert Watsky TED Talk. So those would be my sources for that learning. And then let's see where we are here. Oh, I wanted to mention this, just kind of throw this in context, because we had talked, we did some fairly experimental, work in with educational frameworks this term. That's how I see it anyway. And by incorporating some actual meditation, some actual different methodologies than usual. And this reminded me of, excuse me, back in the day, there was a Maharishi International University that got established, and a lot of this was back in the 70s, and a lot of the professors or whatever at that school would not only do meditation in class, they would do talking, they would do a range of methods, not dissimilar to what we're working with this term, and that's turned into this Maharishi School of Management. It's hard to read this, but down here it describes consciousness-based education, and this is an education that transforms the process of learning by connecting each discipline with the student's personal experience. So this maps pretty well onto my tripartite thing of scholarly, creative, and personal. I guess what my particular model adds in more so is the creative dimension there. So and this was from this Maharishi School of Management website, right? So this just mentions that all of the students and faculty practice transcendental meditation as part of the program of study in a way, and so it's not just an intellectual methodology. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I hadn't really recalled that for quite a while, but that's all in the context of that second bit of learning I did this term. The third one then is I learned, or to some extent relearned or reinforced, that conversation really is magic. So I had some prior experience with this as well. I didn't put that in my diagram, except it's kind of represented by the Macomber element in the diagram. But I have had some pretty remarkable experiences in teaching prior where if a conversation really becomes rich and just with very little guidance actually can cover and uncover content material way beyond the wildest possibilities of learning in a more traditional or solitary fashion. And so it's once again an amazing thing. And again, in my own learning about that this term, we practiced Christina Baldwin's circle practice fairly explicitly as a methodology, and I think it worked well. So that was a nice piece of learning for me to see that manifest in an interesting and I thought really transformative way. So I learned from in-class discussion, literally learned things from it. So that's another element. Macomber obviously was a guy who taught me and had us explore way back when the magic of conversation too, and remembering his statements about that intellectual work tends to be the ecstasies of intellectual work include reading, writing, and conversation, and how adamant he was that third one is where the real fun is, where the real creative fun is, and how often it's neglected. So the conversation part stands out. And then the last element I have in here is basically the theory of knowledge, the idea that we touched on with the walks, that Prigogine and Stengers argue that science is a conversation with nature, and that spirituality might be framed as a conversation with the absolute or something like that, and so on. So that the conversation becomes a very rich metaphor for understanding learning. So all of those pieces go into my third learning network. Again, a couple of them referenced from our own class, and a couple coming from other locations. So those would be my three learnings. In terms of the last one, again, a couple more riffs on the conversation. So we had our own conversational network, and again, others mentioned this too on the last day of class. The class really took a turn at some point when we started doing the circle practice. It was clear that we had some good stuff going on even early on, but it was a little bit like start and stop, a little halting in the first few weeks, and then when we hit the circle practice and got the conversational network really lit up, and we could see each other's faces, and it was a very different phase happened right about then, and that conversational network started to really hum at that point, and so we did some good work there, and then we also produced some. This was the magic part. We produced some magical stuff there that through the conversations about the kind of pop culture programs and games and all kinds of things, we got into I thought, a really insightful discussion of how myth is alive and well in our childhoods, and through like characters and books and games and all kinds of things, and other sources as well. But I thought that was an example of where the conversation drove our learning into a very interesting place. We also got to, in the course, one of the magical things for me was to see that spiritual humanism was one way to characterize the kind of pre-transcendental religiosity, but the whole era of myth and all that Leanna introduced us to, and that exists sort of prior to the era of kind of religions organized in the way we're used to. You could call those spiritual humanism, that in some ways provides a nice contrast or comparison to the idea of religious transcendentalism that Norman Cohn articulated, this sort of the birth of, if you will, and then the potential that spiritual humanism of a different sort is exactly what we're talking about in the classical era with Plato, and possibly talking about in terms of the contemporary era, where there might be a return to spiritual humanism. So we could be looking at this kind of large historical framework where you have a long, long time of spiritual humanism of various sorts, and then you have an interval of religious transcendentalism, and then relatively short interval, and then a relatively potentially really long interval again of spiritual humanism of a different sort. So that's one kind of framework, to at least consider. And again, this came out of our own conversations about where we went with these talks. About really, our talks were kind of focused on this last one, but this was the gist of it, the idea that maybe there's these hybrid monsters. So spiritual humanism would be a kind of hybrid of spiritual, intellectual, aesthetic, etc., in contrast to monomonsters, where someone just sees the world entirely through the lens of intellect, or entirely through the lens of science or spirituality or art, for that matter. And so these became elements for me where we saw the magic of conversation manifest right in our own network. And then we added, throughout the term, folks to our network, and this is where, again, you could be pulling from for support for your own overview or wrap-up of the term. So in Unit 1, we took on the phenomenologists, and kind of finished with that too, with the Jill Bolte-Taylor phenomenological description of a stroke from the inside. We looked at Fellini as kind of depicting that kind of phenomenological approach, a kind of where it's not really clear what the person's actually perceiving and what they're thinking, etc. Rauschenberg, and then also Macomber in that early sort of putting together this kind of compound lens. Then we moved on to the spiritual way of knowing, and looked at Kate Tempest, Christina Baldwin, Karen Armstrong, and again Norman Cohn. And then third unit on creative or aesthetic way of knowing. We included people like Martin Bernal, who took a very creative look at the origins of Western culture, Gerda Lerner, who is associated with the kind of feminist critique of traditional Western culture, Michel Foucault, who talked very creatively about the loss of the ethic of the care of the self in sort of comparison to knowledge of the self. Gaston Bachelard, who ended up being a somewhat minor figure in our work, but a good guy to remember as somebody who really tried explicitly to articulate the aesthetic way of knowing as a way of knowing. And Peter Bogdanovich, his speech has quite a bit in common with Bachelard's point of view. And then in the intellectual way of knowing, we looked at Plato again. The focus on Plato was I thought really good, because he seemed like a pivotal figure between the sort of spiritual humanist and right about the same time when transcendental religiosity was coming on the scene. You also had these kind of fully developed spiritual humanisms, including the one exemplified by Socrates and Chuanzi, and also potentially some, you might say, the Buddha as well. So these were all people we looked at. We touched on at least Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, and Jacques Lacan as modern, not contemporary so much, but modern psychology figures who carry that intellectual approach forward. And then a whole string of people we looked at in the scientific walk. So these were all part of our network. And then ultimately what we did was create a kind of mashup of these two networks, our class network and these other folks that we kind of brought into our conversation. So again, the conversational framework was crucial, I think, and I think it worked pretty well. So a kind of focused subset or circuit board, if you will, again, thinking of this class as more like designed as a circuit board than a course or a particular path through the content. So, and any idea with your own wrap-up is you'll be making your own connections and pulling on your own things. But as a class, I think we tended to focus on the figures, or we tended to bring into our conversation more of these ones that are highlighted in red. So Macombo is I think a pretty important node on our circuit board, so to speak. Kate Tempest certainly, Christina Baldwin in terms of the methodological stuff we did. Karen Armstrong and Norman Cohn I still think are really good sort of backbone people for what we did. Michel Foucault, just for that notion of care of the self, I think in regard to a lot of the conversations we had, I think his work was relevant. Again, I'm hoping that these are I'm not just name dropping here, that these would be people that you could go back to at some point if you felt like you needed to do particular work on a particular project. Plato, again, in that third group down here, was really a kind of standout, and I think I would develop that even further in probably in the next iteration of the class. And then in the last group, the Herbert Watsky, the brain in your gut presentation, I think was fairly important to our work in the scientific walk. Excuse me. Jill Bolte Taylor was kind of like the bookend with the Watsky TED Talk, and then in there were also these Thomas Nagel and David Chalmers, both of whom are starting to really blur that bound between mind and body and think about mind or intelligence in a very different way, a more embodied way. So those are all sort of a kind of focused subset of the figures that we tended to work a little bit more with, these ones in red, than the others. But the others were all part of our network. So to bring this to a close then, so we have the self, society, and cosmos, as I see it, is supportive of this notion that it's actually I like the class. I think it's a pretty sturdy structure, and the connections between self, society, and cosmos are all interesting. It's hard to explore them all in detail, and so we have people take different approaches to this material, but I still think it's a very solid course, and you should be aware that you can develop your own sort of connections, and also, once the class is over, do the same thing, read up further on the people that you're interested in, etc. So that's kind of one way I would sum it up. I'd also sum it up in the old Venn diagram way, that self, society, cosmos has this kind of form where there's a lot of overlap, and then you get down to the real nitty-gritty of this kind of center area where the whole thing becomes a kind of blending zone. And to look at our last slide here, then a potential that occurred to me in the course of making this presentation, actually, that we ended up with sort of an East plus West model of self, sort of echoing that sort of framework of emotional intelligence, the sort of combining of those two things. So even though we didn't talk a whole lot about this, we did talk about the transmission of societal influence on the self. So in terms of language, sort of memes, the way institutional forms and practices that are socially, embodied in institutions, the way that kind of content does produce an effect on the self, and so those arrows move from society into the center. The cosmos, I put rituals and ideas about the big picture and about how those kind of enter into this sort of center combination zone as well. And in the self, you have the uniqueness of personal experience, and and you can include physiology, psychology, etc. in this unique experience. And so you get the thing typically associated with the West is a kind of individual self, a freestanding self. And in this model, you honor that. You have the experiential self there, the unique self, but then you also honor that there's these influences that are sort of beyond the self in some very substantive ways, including the ways that Nagel and Chalmers are talking about in terms of the limits of human knowledge and that kind of thing. And so we end up with maybe this center overlapping area where self, society, and cosmos all overlap. Maybe that is kind of the area that constitutes an East-West model of self, where you get the best of both worlds in a way. So that's my wrap. Again, that's from my point of view. Those are some things that stood out for me that were important this time through the class with my students' mind. I really enjoyed the process. Again, I'm kind of a fiend about enjoying processes, and so I know that this one was, every process has its own signature, and this was not an exception to that. But ultimately, I think the process prevailed. It produced an interesting form. So, and then the assignment again is for you to do the same thing, to sort of wrap things up in your own way. So again, quick reiteration of the prompt. This is also on the course website in the Unit 5 Week 3 page, where you identify 3 things that you learned about yourself, or 3 things that grabbed you during the time frame in which Self, Society, and Cosmos took place this semester. So, and you write about these learnings, how they came about, and so forth. They don't necessarily have to have originated right in this class by any means, but nonetheless have some relationship or happened for you or to you during this time. And then you write about that, how they came about and so forth, and how you think they will be useful to you in your ongoing work on your own worldview. And then you reference, much as I've done in this presentation, you reference, if you want to in a network fashion, or just referencing them, what's the sort of support or that you can add for kind of adding dimensionality to your own thoughts and cognitions and your own feelings and emotions about your learnings, and then post this as a final post on your course blog. And this is due December 11th at 12. So if we have questions, the best way probably at this point is email. So I hope you guys have fun with this.